Every great creative work stands on the shoulders of giants. Welcome to RetroInspection, where we examine and find out where the things we love today came from.
In terms of this being related to Halloween and being a horror film, etc., are any of these themes we talk about now? I haven't watched those movies in some time. I just remember watching the Spencer Tracy, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde as a kid. Well, were these themes present? Have you watched them? Have you seen that? Is it really a horror film, or is it something like we say, an allegory?
I think less so probably to us. But again, like I keep coming back to Frankenstein with this, but like Dracula, you can see how all three of those novels in Victorian England freaked people out. Frankenstein seems incredibly sedate by our modern standards. This somewhat less so. This has a little, this has a little more punch to it. And Dracula, obviously, it's I haven't read that in 30 years, but it's sexual themes. In the 1880s, 1890s, spilled a lot of beer. So much more shocking in its time than we would find it nowadays. However, we see the reverberations from this, which is kind of how we came to want to talk about it in the first place. I'll go back to Stephen King. He points out that it's a werewolf story. I agree completely. And you see versions of this. The Incredible Hulk's the obvious one. That's your gimme right there. Especially considering that the Hulk in his original conception was even more of a literal werewolf than your typical werewolf, because the Hulk transformation didn't depend on the full moon. It's just a thing Banner did when it got dark. PM Banner became the Hulk in the early comics, like when the Hulk was still gray. Eventually, they pull that back to just when he becomes angry, when he is under stress or frightened or whatever, the transformation occurs. Fucking Star Trek. Well, we're always going to come back to Star Trek, because Star Trek recycled all of these tropes. The enemy within, the transporter accident, good Kirk, bad Kirk. And Shatner does the same thing that like Spencer Tracy does, but there's not really makeup, but he's screwed up his face and he's covered in sweat and they smudged up his eyes with makeup and he's all but doing this shit and capering around the corridors of the Enterprise, being a bad guy, and he's drinking and he's, groping Janice Rand and that kind of shit.
And I'll remind you, Spencer Tracy and William Shatner worked together in a very famous film,
Judgment in Nuremberg.
Right. So continue with your.
Well, no, I was going to say, so you do that, or you get if we're talking about the adaptations, the really obvious one is Frederick March all dolled up as basically JoJo the dog-faced boy. To the point where you're like, there's no way they would nobody's going to let this guy into a bar, let alone the upper echelons of Victorian society where he can ravish virgins and shit, because he looks like a goddamn werewolf in that movie. And I think there was a Lon Chaney Sr. version, so I think there was a silent version.
Yes.
Which I've seen stills of. I've never watched. I've never watched any of the adaptations recently. I'm going off of kind of dim memories here. I didn't revisit those. So, but we see the split personality.
Well, I remember the Spencer Tracy version, and Spencer Tracy himself was not a very big person, but there was something that he did in that where he just filled up the screen with menace. So as a kid, that did frighten me. So I can see where this was a horror film.
I think he was kind of short, but decent shoulders. He wasn't like a narrow
he was a stocky gentleman.
Irish guy. What do you want?
So you talked about the Incredible Hulk. You talked about Star Trek. There's also this kind of theme, this duality of man theme, just runs right through almost every Stephen King book. Goes into the crime fiction when you talk about Dr. Lecter, and especially Buffalo Bill, who's trying to become the new thing.
Yeah. There's that public face, private face dichotomy. Sure. Really, any goddamn evil twin story.
Yeah.
Whether that's Bewitched, whether it's I Dream of Jeannie, whether it's Knight Rider, there's somebody who looks more or less like the protagonist, but has all of their, bad qualities, or is their moral and ethical opposite.
So, in a kind of a twist of history, Treasure Island, which was probably his most famous work in his time, is far less influential. Well, I'm just arguing that it's far less influential than this book, this novella, which was a hit during his time, but it was, the themes that he wrote about, the way he did it, while he was inspired, say, by lycanthropy and some of the other earlier Gothic work, have reverberated to today in ways that Treasure Island had. So.
See, that's a tough call, because these days, I would say for the entire course of the 20th century on up to now, if you do a pirate movie, you're dragging you're dragging Treasure Island into it somehow.
Yeah, okay. So early Hollywood did a lot of
that. Said, there's fewer pirate movies, certainly after World War II, as compared to there's a lot more like monster movies where it's a split of some kind within an individual. That you're probably right. That's probably a more common trope. It's just, but people still Treasure Island is assigned to kids. Kids still read that in school. Rarely is Strange Case, assigned. Frankenstein is probably more likely to be assigned.
Yeah, I haven't read Frankenstein in quite a long time. I remember reading Frankenstein and not liking it very well.
You got those first 3 chapters are a bear, man. They're rough. When the original narrator is just gassing on about him and his sister and how he's got to get ready for this trip to the North Pole. Once the guy actually runs across Dr. Frankenstein up in the Great White North, the novel picks up as much as it's ever going to. It's like I said, it's much more sedate than this one.
Well, comparing writers, I think Mary Shelley was, not quite contemporaries, was a lesser writer than, say, Jane Austen, who really had a gift for narrative that immediately brought you into the story. And just like Frankenstein, Dracula was a big drag for me as well. I'll just put it this way: Hollywood and the screenwriters in Hollywood, especially in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, really did a service for these stories and made them quite a bit more timeless than I think the actual skill shown in writing them would have. To me, they're very dense and mostly not enjoyable.
Like, subscribe, repost, share everywhere. To see what else we're up to, visit xynobooks.com, xenobooks.com.